Rob decided to go to his own apartment first. He didn't want to show up and have to cut the reunion short by bolting for the bathroom before they all gagged on his fumes. He pulled into a temporary parking space at a meter, since he wasn't planning on staying there long. It was free to park there until the meter started running again at 8 in the morning. The car had started to run hot on the way back. It had been through a lot for an oldie, but it had made it back in okay shape. There was some slight body damage from backing into the tree, and there was dust and dirt splattered all over it from the varying terrible road conditions, but it was still in decent drivable shape. He would hate to hand the keys back over to Sue and have her look over his shoulder at her car that was steaming from under the hood and shaking, and then watch it fall completely apart, leaving only a standing frame on collapsed wheels. He was sure it would be all right after it had a chance to cool down for a bit. It had that chance while Rob was upstairs finally getting a shower. He had opened his overflowing mailbox on the way in. It was mostly just full of junk mail that he threw into the lobby's wastebasket. The phone bill and the electric bill were hiding in there amongst all the coupons and advertisements. They had almost gotten thrown away too, but they slipped out from one of the pamphlet's pages and landed on the tile floor. Rob was glad he had not missed them and had to pay an added-on late fee. His luck could have been crappy, but it seemed like things were changing. In the old typical days, those bills would have just passed right by him and on into the trash until the late notices came. Things would be different than they used to be. They would be better. He had opened his apartment door and a strange feeling of intrusion came upon him. He felt like he was invading on someone else's turf. He had only been staying away for about 2 weeks, but his apartment already felt so distant and tied to an old life that he no longer had. He was no longer a beaten-down 9-to-5 machine who could barely take care of a geriatric animal and only got to see his friends occasionally to break up his monotonous routine. He was a new man. He was his own man, for starters. He had lost his animal friend, but when that door had closed, the window had opened to strengthen his friendship with Sue, and he had made a new friend with Michelle. He was also a man who had faced insurmountable odds and had beaten them. He had downright kicked ass. He was moderately sore and still undergoing some strange sensations as a side effect to the concoction he had ingested, but he knew he was going to be fine, and he felt like it was the first time he'd ever felt that way. Even a few weeks ago, before his life had become such a supernatural melodrama, he had not felt like he would be okay. Just making ends meet had felt like a battle for survival. He'd had no idea what that really felt like. He did after he got back from his brief but thorough journey. Things were in a whole new perspective. Even if life went back to every detail feeling like it was harder than it should be, it would not be able to touch him near as much as it had before. It was hard to picture getting so upset or worried about such seemingly trivial aspects of life. It was a gift to have those things be the biggest problems of your day. His apartment was in good shape. The demons hadn't come and rearranged any more furniture. It didn't look as if the killer had stopped by either. Rob was so relieved to think of him without getting a feeling of looming dread in his gut. He felt he should be able to feel even better than that, and think of him as the dead fucker, instead of as the killer anymore. But the events of his death still hadn't fully registered. It still seemed too good to be true. It couldn't really be all over. It was so much to comprehend, and so many of the otherworldly aspects made some of it seem impossible to ever fully understand. The killer, the dead fucker, was dead, though. Rob knew that, even if he wasn't yet able to feel it. While Rob was showering and watching the water going down the drain turn black to gray to milky to clear, he replayed the events in his head. He embellished some of them for his own sense of dramatic purposes. He had made himself so powerful in the moment he had killed the dead fucker. He had yanked that stick back out of the eye socket and stabbed it back in 3 or 4 times. It felt good. He wondered how he would readjust to being out in normal society. How would it be to function like an everyday person knowing what he knew was out there? He had done it before, though. He had always speculated about the reality of the demons, but somewhere deep down, he had always known they were real, and he had been out in the world plenty with that buried knowledge. Maybe it would be easier since so many things had come to the surface. They were out in the open to him, and even if he didn't understand everything about the way things were, he understood a hell of a lot more than he did before. As he studied his body for more changes, he thought more about how he had great friends in Sue and Michelle. He had functioned as well as he could with them, given the circumstances he had been in. They had been able to have fun in between all the trying times. He would function in the rest of the world, just as he had functioned with them. They had operated like normal people too, and they were also going through insane situations right there along with him. They had been so patient. If they couldn't forgive him for running out and stealing their car, he would make them forgive him. He would make it all up to them. The first thing he would do would be to take them out to a nice dinner. He would make it up more to them with every day that went by as best as he could. He didn't really see any further noticeable changes in his body. His skin felt different when he touched it. It felt firm, like smooth scar tissue. It was as tough as it was smooth. His veins also were still larger than he remembered them, but maybe they had grown out from all the adrenaline that had coursed through them. He was lean. He was muscular, but he had been in pretty good shape before. He worked out occasionally, but he was blessed with a naturally athletic build. It was always leaner than he liked from stress and not being able to afford much food most of the time, but he could work on that more. Anything he didn't like about his life he would fix. He had fixed what seemed like an unfixable problem, and he felt like he was ready to tackle anything. How could it possibly compare? He hoped his perspective wouldn't change with a bit of time passing. He didn't want to become jaded with the boring reality of everyday living making things seem worse than they were in the grand scheme of things. He wanted to practice his new feeling about how he would handle life instead of just thinking about it. He would try his best to maintain his new attitude. It felt healthy. It was the first time he felt that way, inside and out. Time was nearing the wee hours of the morning. If Sue and Michelle had to work that night, they should be getting home by about that time. He had gotten back so quickly. There had not been as much anticipation of what he was driving to. That had probably helped speed the time up. There had just been excitement of getting back and letting them know he was all right. He couldn't wait to tell them what had happened, but he considered leaving that part for until after they had slept. He would simply just let them know that it was all over and everything would be fine. They would trust him. He couldn't wait any longer. He didn't want to call them to tell them he was on his way. Normally that was an appreciated courtesy, but it had to be done in person. If it was their day off, they would still be up anyhow. He was sure he could alleviate their worry about him, and they would be happy to get their transportation back. He would take the car in to get serviced as well. That was the least he owed them. The car sputtered back to life after its brief rest, and the needles climbed back to almost their previous positions. The temperature gauge was just over the halfway mark, whereas before he had turned off the ignition, it had almost been up in the red. He drove quickly, but he carefully stayed in tune with the car's hiccups and needs for slowing down from time to time. She had been good to him, and he would be good to her. He was starting to know the car, and what it wanted really well. He would have to buy one of his own soon. It would be hard to hand it back over, but it was not his. He had to drive around the streets for a while, looking for a parking space near Sue's building. The next day was street cleaning at 10 in the morning, and he did not want to still be up at that hour to move the car. It was hard to imagine sleeping after what the day had brought, but he at least wanted the option. He could take a sleeping pill if he wanted to. He wouldn't, though. He wanted to test out his dreams first. What if the dead fucker was permanently asleep and always waiting for him in that hazy limbo realm? That was the first thought that gave that dead fucker a feeling of menace since his death. Rob would test it out, though. He would deal with whatever came along. Finally, he got a space a few blocks away. He got out of the car and got the suitcase, too. He had packed fresh clothes, and had thrown the clothes he was wearing into one of his neighboring building's dumpsters. They were the clothes he had worn after killing a man. It had not really been much of a man anymore, though. He wasn't being overly paranoid about being caught, but it was a reasonable precaution to take. He had not gone much out of his way. The books were still in there, too. They had been lifesavers, and he would keep them around. He figured they would be with him for the rest of his life. The apple was still in there, too. It was holding up rather well. It wasn't even soft. He left the potted plant in the car. He had no more need for it, and it was cumbersome. It wasn't the kind of thing someone broke into a car to steal, but he placed it in the trunk anyway. It would probably die in there, but its time was over. He was thankful to it. He walked briskly. The night air felt good. He felt so much more in touch with nature after spending the night out in it, even if he had been unconscious for the majority of it. It felt like he was taking the longest walk ever. He could see Sue's building. He was slowly getting closer to it. It wasn't happening fast enough. It was painstaking how close he was, but how far away he still felt from it. It would be 5 more minutes for him to get to it, make it into the lobby, ride the elevator up, walk to their door, and knock on it. He started to jog slightly to hurry up the process a bit. He was nervous about seeing them under the conditions he had left on, and even though he knew they would be understanding, he still wanted to get that awkward part over with as soon as possible. He went through that dreaded process of making it to Sue's front door. It felt like it had taken much longer than 5 minutes. He stood outside the door and listened for the sounds from within. He hoped to hear them giggling and chatting on the other side. He hoped at least for the sound of the television. There was only silence. He could see that a light was on through the peephole. It was always left on, though. He sighed and knocked. There was no answer. He knocked again. He had the key, but he didn't want to be invasive. He also hadn't wanted to be sitting there waiting for them. He wanted to surprise them, not the other way around. That would make the reunion feel off-balanced. He would already be inside, and that felt overly presumptuous. He wanted to be invited in. He sighed again and started deciding whether or not to go back to his apartment. It wasn't fair to expect them to just be waiting for him all that time. What had it been? Rob realized it had almost been a week since he left. It felt much longer than that. He started to turn when he heard someone ask hoarsely who it was. Had he woken them? Maybe they went to bed early. That wasn't part of the plan either, for him to groggily be received. Was that Sue or Michelle? The voice was unrecognizable. He spoke up. Hey, I'm back." "What?" The voice sounded alarmed and more alert. Rob saw a shadow go over the peephole. "It's me, Rob. I'm back." There was a pause, and then the clicking of the locks being unlocked. The door swung open, and there stood Sue in her bathrobe. Her hair was a rat's nest on her head. Her eyes were dark underneath. She squinted in the hall light. She looked confused. She looked awful. "Sue?" he said at first. She rubbed her eyes deeply with her fingertips. "Rob?" "Yeah, it's me. I'm back." He smiled at her. She did not smile back. She looked him up and down for a moment. Rob stopped smiling. "I'm so sorry that I left, but it's over now. I brought your car back." He smiled again meagerly and waited for a response. "I didn't recognize you." She sounded disoriented. "Well, it's me." She sighed heavily and looked numbly at him. "Do you want me to go? I can come back tomorrow. Your car is parked up just past Franklin Street." He would take the bus back. It was obviously not a good time. She must have been sound asleep. "Oh, Rob," she said as her arms went limp at her sides. She quickly brought them back up and hugged him above his shoulders. He hugged her back with the arm that was not holding the suitcase. She pulled him inside and closed the door.